Hey, welcome back. Here's our video on macromolecules. Now, I'll be honest with you, we're just going to barely touch the tip of the iceberg today with what macromolecules are. We've got a whole nother chapter coming up starting next week where we're going to get into a lot more detail on each of the macromolecules. So, just the basics today. All right, here's an activity I really enjoy taking a look at, relative size of an atom. Let's see if we can get it to pop up here. There we go. Fantastic. Okay. So here we are looking at the size of a coffee bean. Hopefully we can all picture that. A grain of rice or a sesame seed. The smallest thing you see right there is supposed to be a grain of salt. So that's probably barely visible to the human eye. And we're going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit. So there's our grain of salt, and that's probably about the limits of what your eye can see without any help. We start to get a little bit smaller than that, and now we can see some of the largest single cells. So an amoeba is one of the largest single-celled organisms. You can just about, probably not quite, but just about see it with the naked eye. If we were to put it under a light microscope, though, we could see it pretty well. Paramecium, another example of a single cell that you can just about see with your eye, but not quite, just a little bit too small. Up here in the top, we see the largest human cell, and only about half of us have that, the human egg cell. So we get smaller, we see a human skin cell, which is probably a little bit closer in size to the average cell type. Continue to get even smaller. Here's a red blood cell, relative size. Here's baker's yeast, a rather large bacteria. Here is a chromosome, so that's a stretch of DNA. You might be looking at that and saying, hey, wait a minute, how in the world do I have 46 of these squeezed inside of a red blood cell? It's an excellent question, and the answer is you don't. Believe it or not, red blood cells do not have a nucleus. They don't have any DNA. So just kind of an interesting fact we're throwing out there. As we get smaller, here's a mitochondria. That is a cell organelle. We learn about those guys in a couple of chapters. Lysosome, same thing. And here's a pretty typical sized bacteria. So bacteria, much, much smaller than your typical human cell. Go ahead and go even smaller. And we get to the viruses. Here's a bacteriophage. We'll talk about those guys in a couple weeks. An HIV virus, the influenza virus, and the measles virus. So viruses are itty bitty 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 bitty. Keep going even more in. We get the ribosome and rhinovirus. That's a very small virus, causes the common cold. The ribosome here is a very, very useful piece of equipment. I don't think we start talking about that much until we get to second semester, though. So for right now, I can just throw out that it makes proteins. Going even smaller here, hemoglobin. This is a very common protein, if you guys are aware. That's what actually literally carries the oxygen in your red blood cells. Here is tRNA. If you've ever heard of DNA, RNA is very similar. Here's a phospholipid. That's one of the 4 macromolecules we're going to talk about today. Going even smaller here, here's a molecule of glucose, an atom of carbon, and finally water. So water is very, very small. You can look at it. It's actually comparable to just one single atom of carbon. I'm going through all this and showing you guys all this because today we're starting with macromolecules. Yesterday we really focused on water molecules, so very, very small molecule versus the macromolecules, which are phospholipids, proteins, and DNA or RNA. So you can see how much larger these macromolecules are than the tiny itty bitty water molecule we have been talking about. And then even those macromolecules are really, really small in comparison with even just an average sized cell. You pull out, and man, there we go. Very small compared to everyday items. All right, so back to our presentation again. Just wanted to kind of show you the presentation, the rough size of an atom, and, for that matter, water. So the compounds and atoms we were talking about yesterday are really very small, very minuscule compared to that with the cell. So in biology, when we start talking about cells and how they work, we're going to look at a bigger type of compound. These bigger type of compounds are called macromolecules. So macro in Greek means large, and that's why they're called macromolecules, much, much larger than water. So again, here's an image just kind of illustrating water is itty bitty versus a macromolecule. This happens to be a protein, how gigantic, how large macro it is versus a smaller molecule like water. All right, for this chapter, I think just knowing the 4 types of macromolecules is probably enough, and here they are. The 4 types or 4 categories of macromolecules are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So if you've ever heard of, again, DNA and RNA, well, the NA in both of those stands for nucleic acids. So each of our macromolecules is made up of these repeating subunits that we call monomer units. Mono in Greek means one. So you have just one monomer, it's just one of them. You start to put them together into these longer and longer chains, and you get what we call a polymer. Poly means many. So a lot of times we call our macromolecules polymers. They're a collection of a lot or many monomers. I always think a good analogy is thinking of a train. So a train is kind of like the macromolecule or polymer. The whole complete thing has a lot of individual parts. For a train, we call them train cars. And each train car makes up a portion of the train. You have these repeating parts. Here's a train car, then repeat again. Here's a train car, then repeat again. Here's a train car. And the whole thing makes up the train. And the same is true of macromolecules. We have these individual units called monomers, and we repeatedly link them over and over and over again. And that's where we get our macromolecule polymer from, repeating monomer units, just like cars repeating a train. Again, not a whole lot of detail today, just kind of the basics. We're going to get way, way more into each of these macromolecules in the next unit in the coming weeks. Get a quick heads up on hopefully some of the terms and some of the concepts that hopefully you picked up today.